Awesome. I'm going to start by introducing Christine and Victoria and Lauren. Yeah. From the Invasive Species Center. They're going to start us off this morning. You guys take it away.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. That's more like it. I bet you guys are a little bit more happy to be in a nice air-conditioned place. A little bit out of the heat today, so a bit of a reprieve. Glad to have you here. Glad everyone could join us this morning. Before we start, I just wanted to check and make sure everybody has one of each of these colored cards. If you don't, can you please raise your hand and somebody will come around and make sure that you have one. Yeah. And all the teachers too, advisors, you guys can have some too. So, Chris, where did he go? So just raise your hand and we'll see if we can get somebody to bring those around to you. Okay, thanks. Okay, so while we're doing that, I'm going to explain what these cards are about. So what we're going to do today is Lauren is going to do a presentation for you and about invasive species. And intermingled in that, we're going to do a little bit of audience participation to get you guys, keep you awake, keep you active, keep you entertained. So these blue cards here are going to represent a native habitat. So everybody hold up your blue card. Perfect.
Keep them up.
Okay, this is the blue one, not that one. Perfect. So now, okay, you can put them down. At various points in the presentation, I'm going to get you to hold up your cards, and we're going to snap a photo, and we're going to put it up on the screen. So right now, everybody here is represented as a native habitat. So Victoria's going to take a picture of us as a native habitat. So everybody hold up your blue card again.
Nice and high.
Not the yellow one, the blue one. Okay, hold it facing forward if you can. Ready? Perfect. Thank you. So while Victoria gets that up on the screen, what I'm going to do is explain the yellow card now. This is an invasive species or invaded habitat. So during the time that we're going to be doing this little game, so to speak, you're going to hold up one or either of these cards depending on whether you're a native habitat or an invaded habitat. Okay? So just keep that in mind. So, did anybody get those cards? Okay, I'll make sure you have them. Okay, perfect. All right. Okay. Okay, sorry. We don't have this. Here, screen's not on.
Okay. Good to go?
Okay, we'll put that picture up then when we're ready for the next time around. Okay, Victoria? Okay. All right, now I'm going to pass it over to Lauren. She's going to start the presentation, and we're going to stop partway through and do a little more activity.
Okay, guys. Can everyone hear me? I need to lean into the mic. Okay, good. Awesome. So, as Christine mentioned, I'm Lauren. You may remember me from a workshop on Monday. So I'm going to walk you through some invasive species management stuff. And I'm going to apologize right off the bat because we're from Ontario, so a lot of the species mentioned are Ontario species, so I'll try to give you as much background as you'll need before I keep going. So, invasive species management is kind of a huge overarching topic when we talk about invasive species. There's lots of things you need to consider, and as you can see by this crazy mind map, I'm going to try to walk you through all the steps individually so you get a good idea of the holistic aspects of invasive species management. So first off, all of you should know by now what invasive species are. They can be plants, animals, fish, insects, fungus, diseases, microorganisms that are introduced to a new location. So here's some prime examples of invasive species. On your left, it's emerald ash borer. So these little leaf-eating, wood-boring insects get into the ash trees, and their larvae eat galleries throughout all of the inside of the tree and make it so that it can't transport nutrients. So these are a huge issue, widespread throughout North America, completely killing off the ash trees. Up here at the top, this is oak wilt. So it's actually a fungus that can be spread throughout the root system of oak trees. And it's completely wiping out oak populations. Actually, right now in Michigan is a big issue. This guy is an invasive plant. It's garlic mustard. Completely dominates forest understories, and it releases a toxin basically into the soil that prevents native species from growing there. And then round goby on the bottom left, super bad invasive fish, and it's outcompeting all sorts of native fish species. So invasive species can be almost any type of species, and what makes them a problem, obviously, is that they can cause disruptions in the natural environment, competing with native plants and animals for all sorts of resources. So prime example, this is kudzu vine, and as you can see, it's very good at growing over everything. So this is a picture of a barn, but it could easily be a tree that kudzu is growing on top of, and that outcompetes the tree for light resources, for nutrient uptake, and it can become the dominant species in the area. And over time, these invasive species can actually cause extinction of native plants or animals and vastly reduce biodiversity and permanently alter the habitat. So this is an aerial view of where mountain pine beetle has gone through. So this is a lodgepole pine forest, probably in BC or Alberta, and all of the dead trees are from mountain pine beetle. So they go in, and again, they make it so that the tree can't transport nutrients properly, and they die off. So, what makes a good invader? So they can tolerate a wide variety of habitat conditions. It gives them the ability to really spread throughout North America. They can travel up all the way through the States into Canada and across. They grow and reproduce extremely quickly, and they are very aggressive competitors for resources, so they'll outcompete native species. So prime example of growing quickly and competing aggressively for resources, these are some grass carp. Now I'm sure some of you know what grass carp are already, but these species can completely wipe out aquatic vegetation in an area. They eat up to like 40% of their body weight a day, and they reproduce extremely quickly. So they can quickly become the dominant species in a habitat. So invasive species also lack natural predators or pathogens in their newly invaded area. So in their native habitat, they might have natural predators, but what makes them so good in their invaded range is that they don't have that check on their population. They also have the ability to create unfavorable conditions for native species. So as I mentioned before, garlic mustard can actually create an environment where native species can't grow because it changes the soil chemistry. So prime example of those two, those little guys are zebra mussels. The big one on the bottom is a native mussel. So the zebra mussels will actually form their dense mats and live on top of the native mussel and make it impossible for that mussel to filter feed and to survive. And eventually it'll die off. So the zebra mussels are outcompeting the native mussels, and they're actually directly harming it. So before I go into how invasive species get introduced, we are going to introduce our own little invasive species.
Okay, Victoria, did you want to put that up on the screen?
Oh,
now?
I can do that.
All right. So we're going to show you a picture of what you guys look like as an invaded habitat, or as a native habitat. So there you are. You're all blue, and you're a native habitat. So what we're going to do now is we're going to introduce an invasive species into our native habitat. So this little guy here, this little happy face ball, we're going to give him a name. We'll call him an emoji bug. So he's a nasty little guy. He's very highly invasive and very high risk to invade in our nice little habitat here. All the parameters that he likes, the food, the type of shelter and whatever, we have it here. So he likes this, he likes the climate. And while we weren't watching, he was infested in some shipping crates that were brought into our region. And the shipping crates were right over here. So that's where they ended up. They were deposited there, left sitting out of the warehouse, and the bug got out, started moving into the habitat. So we're going to pass this ball around the room, and what I'm going to ask you to do is pass it to people beside you, behind you, in front of you, at a random fashion. You can't hot potato it. Just count to 3, like 1001, 1002, 1003, and then pass it to the next person. You can't throw it. You can't not take it, so if somebody passes it to you, you have to take it. And we'll just have it move around the room, and we'll see how that works. I think I just lost my mic. And so that at some point in our next break, we're going to have you raise up your cards again. So if you've touched the emoji bug ball, you are now an invaded habitat. So when I ask you to raise your cards and you've touched the ball, you then are going to raise your yellow card. If you didn't touch it, you still raise your blue one. Any questions? Okay, start the ball going, and we'll let Lauren get back.
Okay, so we've introduced invasive species over there, but I'll talk to you about how other invasive species might get introduced. So these are plants and animals we're talking about. They naturally disperse to begin with. That's okay. That's what they do. All species do it, but invasive species tend to be pretty good at it. That's what makes them good at spreading. So this is Phragmites, or European common reed, and it's like a wetland invasive plant. It takes over ditches and like riparian zones, and it's really good at these big seed pods at the top. Are really good at spraying around in the wind. So it's really easy to spread a patch of Phragmites because of these seeds at the top. So wind is a natural dispersal method for invasive plants. This is emerald ash borer again. Insects, they can fly, so that's a great natural dispersal method for them. You can't contain them to one tree because they can fly to the next one. And obviously invasive fish. I've heard from a few of you that northern snakehead is your favorite or least favorite, whatever, invasive aquatic species. So this guy is actually a special type of natural dispersal because not only can it swim to new lakes and river systems, this one can actually go over land as well. It can go through the mud and spread to new water systems and become invasive there. And they eat absolutely everything in an ecosystem. These ones are especially bad. So invasive species also get spread quite quickly by humans. We're really good at spreading species around. Sometimes, unfortunately, it's intentional. So this is a lovely aquarium with some nice tropical fish, but on your left, there is hydrilla, and that's an invasive plant species that was first brought in an aquarium. But fragments of it can break off when you wash out your tanks, and it can get into the natural ecosystem. It's a submerged plant. It becomes almost impossible to do any recreational activity in that water system because it completely clogs out the water system. It gets stuck in your boat motor, you can't swim in it, you can't fish in it. So that's something simple where someone thinks it looks like a nice plant and they bring it in intentionally, but they don't really realize that it could get out of their closed system and become an invasive species. So ornamental plants in gardens are also a really big problem with invasive species. This is periwinkle. A lot of people still plant it in their garden because it looks pretty, but unfortunately it's really good at getting out of the garden system and into a natural ecosystem. They completely blanket forest floors and prevent other native species from coming through. And then this is a black carp. So it was originally brought over for aquaculture purposes, and it did a great job at that. It's very good at eating mollusks like mussels and snails from aquaculture facilities. So it was brought in to do a job, and it did it very well. Unfortunately, it does that job very well in the natural system as well. So it gets out and invades a natural river system and eats all of the native snails and mussels. And to give humans the benefit of the doubt, a lot of the time these introductions are actually unintentional. So ballast water was the main pathway for aquatic invasive species into the Great Lakes. Species get picked up from the ballast water in one country and get dumped into the Great Lakes, and they become a great invasive species there. Luckily, we've largely shut down this pathway with legislation, but at the time it was a huge problem. So, as we mentioned with our emoji bug, firewood is wood pallets is a huge transporter of invasive species. You might not notice a small larva in the wood pallet when it gets moved, and then you've released it into a new area. And on top of it, the firewood, also a problem. In Ontario, we have our Don't Move Firewood campaign. So you buy local firewood and you burn it there. You don't move it across. Yeah? Well, I'll finish this one off. Okay. So this is bait buckets. From the workshops, you may have learned that they're a really bad spreader of invasive aquatic species. So you can get viral hemorrhagic septicemia, all sorts of fish species, as well as plants as well. So stop moving the ball.
Okay, so where's our emoji bug? Where's it ended up? Okay, up there. So yeah, it's moved around. Started way over here, it's all the way up there now. I'm just going to set the volume on that. Okay. No, we're good. Okay. So let's stop moving the ball for a minute, our emoji bug ball, and we're gonna snap a photo of where it's spread in the audience. So which habitat has now been invaded. So if you touch the ball, hold up your yellow card. If you didn't, hold up your blue card. Just hold it for a minute while she gets a nice panoramic view of this. Okay, perfect. So while Victoria's getting that up on the screen for us to actually see what's going on, you might have been able to see a little bit from where you're sitting, but when you see the whole picture, like from what I can see up here, you can tell that it's moved from all the way over here, up that whole side and across the top. So it's spread quite a bit in the short period of time that we've actually been moving this ball around. And in some instances, that could mimic an invasive species spreading. If it's very prolific, and it's very able to move around, it can spread very rapidly. So let's presume that this picture that we just took is kind of mimicking our little groups, our management groups, invasive species surveillance program. So we go out on a periodic basis. We check out our native habitat to see what's in there, or we have citizen scientists going around and identifying. Possibly then somebody's just picked it up. They've said, oh, this isn't native. I haven't seen this before. I bet you it's invasive. They report it. So then, of course, we do our survey, and this is what we find. So now we have to come to an idea, what are we going to do? We research it. We look up, what is this emoji bug? What does it do? Where does it live? You know, what kind of species is it? What does it eat? What habitat is it native to? Like, what does it like? So we find out some information about that. And then we figure out what management action that we have to do. So for our little community, we've decided we're going to use these little management balls. And these little management balls, we're going to do the same thing. This could be any kind of management action, and it depends on the species. It could be that we're going to spray, we're going to maybe inject trees that are in the local area. This bug is invading. We're not going to be specific. We're just going to say it's a management action. So because we have done our bit of a survey and we know where the invasive species is, we're going to start our management action in the regions. And I'm going to have to bring this one all the way up there. Jeez, you guys are so good at moving this around. Somebody up there want to catch that? Perfect. Okay, so we have our management balls now moving around. Well, not yet, not till we're done. And we're going to move these around the same way as we move the invasive species around. And so we're going to try and move it around because we know where the invasives are. So we're going to try and move it in those areas. Now the invasive species, the emoji bug, is still going to be moving around because it's still out there. And maybe it's at the leading edge of where it stopped. So we know it's still going to keep going, right? And we know it's going to keep spreading, but we're going to try and manage it at the same time. So we'll do that. But because we're such a good management group, and we like our neighbors, we like our neighbors' habitat, we want their habitat to remain invasive-free, we've talked to our neighboring community, which is right over here, and we've told them, hey, we have an invasive. You guys really need to do something. So they've decided to put up some kind of a barrier to prevent it from getting into their region. And this barrier could be anything from putting up a lot of signs about not moving wood, or maybe they've put up some roadside inspections where people with firewood have to pull over, that sort of thing. They've done some stuff. So we're going to make this the barrier right here. So now our emoji bug can't travel across this aisle. So if it gets over to here, it can't go over there. So it has to stay on this side. So when you're moving the bug around, can't go over there. You guys are safe. Okay? So here we are. Can you guys see that okay? So you can see where the invaded area is, up along the top and along the side. All right. And because this bug has already started to invade, and it's spread itself out pretty well, now there's more of it. And it's going to be able to spread a little bit quicker because there's more to spread. So we're going to add a new one in to mimic an increasing population. And this population, because it's ever expanding, and our management is going to try and catch up to it, but because our leading edge is right here, you guys are invaded, or you guys? Okay. So we're going to start expanding the range of this bug. It's going to go a little bit quicker. Okay. You can start moving your balls around.
So, with the impacts of the emoji bug up there, I'm going to walk you through some real-world impacts of invasive species. So, zebra mussels, I mentioned them before. They're really good at outcompeting native mussels. They pile on top of them, make it hard for them to survive. And so in Ontario, where we are now, between $75 and $91 million per year of total impacts in Ontario, just due to zebra mussels. I heard kind of an anecdote that Windsor spends a ton of money every year on water treatment just to make their water taste better because of zebra mussel decomposition. It tastes like zebra mussels. So they have to spend a bunch of money all the time making sure that it doesn't taste like zebra mussels. So not only do they cost money to manage them, they also impact societal things. So this is a beach. This isn't sand. This is all zebra mussel. So once they die, they wash up on shore, and these guys are sharp. So you don't really want to be hanging out on a beach, laying there relaxing on basically what are shards of broken glass. That's not really your idea of a good time. And so areas that rely on like beach tourism and recreation are going to be really seriously impacted by the lack of people showing up to their beaches. And also, like I mentioned, they decompose. They're living organisms, so once they start to decompose, they stink. So these beaches are sharp and they smell awful. So that's not my idea of a great vacation. Don't know about you guys, but I probably wouldn't go to this beach. Also, boat owners tend to get this if they leave their boats in the water. Zebra mussels can totally clog up motors, make it almost impossible to use, and also huge pathway for invasive species as well. If you don't notice these guys, I'm sure you're noticing this, but if it was just one or two and you go to a new lake, you could spread them pretty easily. And they're a huge problem for industry as well. So this is a water pipe that was put in an area where zebra mussels are, and quickly it becomes clogged with these mats of zebra mussels, and it becomes extremely expensive to clear out these pipes to keep the water flowing. So hydroelectric facilities and nuclear facilities that really need that intake of water are being seriously impacted by this. And even local like cottage owners, if they have a water line out into their lake, this could impact the way that they take water in. So, as I mentioned before, emerald ash borer kills millions of trees. In Ontario alone, it's killed over 1 million, and it's estimated that the cost to municipalities across Canada could reach $2 billion over the 30-year period since they've been introduced. So when an emerald ash borer infestation comes in, it's the municipality's responsibility, if it's on municipal property, to take the trees down. So that's taxpayer dollars being put into cutting trees down, and they just look awful. You have to take them down because they become a risk to human health. They could break off. They become a risk to infrastructure. And it's all because of these tiny little beetles. So these are 2 exit holes you can see on your left. And then these are the adults that would have emerged from them. So as you can see, they're not very big. That's a penny. For the Canadians, we don't use them anymore, but you remember what size they are. And this is what the larvae do to an ash tree. These are feeding galleries. So the larva gets under the bark and starts feeding away, and this eventually will kill the tree. And then they look like this. This was a beautiful city street that was lined with ash trees. Now it's a beautiful city street lined with dead trees. And so all of these trees have to come down because they could easily start breaking off, injuring pedestrians, damaging the road and the cars that might be driving under them. And that costs a lot of money. And if one of these trees happens to be on your property, it's your responsibility to take it down. Because if you're not taking it down, not only could you potentially spread the invasive, but it could then fall on your house and you've got a bigger issue. And Asian carp. So, Canada has spent $17.5 million just on prevention, because we're in the lucky seat to be able to be preventing Asian carp from getting in. So fighting the good fight, but it still costs a lot of money to do that. And the States has it worse. They're spending tons of money on managing and trying to prevent them from getting into the Great Lakes as well. So the US has spent $99 million on the electric barriers to prevent Asian carp from migrating further up and getting into the Great Lakes. And as you know, they jump. Now, only silver carp jump, so that's good. It's not all four. But they still leap out of the water up to 3 meters, 9 feet, and they can hit you in the face, basically. They've caused concussions, broken bones, they damage boats and fishing equipment. They're not the kind of fish you want in your waterway, and they bleed everywhere also. They're really gross. This is another example of the jumping behavior of silver carp. And so they're not, this isn't, it may look fun when it's not in your backyard, but I'm sure there's a few people who this is in their backyard and they can attest to the fact that you don't want it. So silver carp and bighead carp both eat plankton out of the water super rapidly, and they make it impossible for the native species to eat the plankton in the water, and then they die off. And so, as I mentioned, black carp and grass carp before also do that for other species. So when you get all four together, it becomes a perfect storm of feeding behavior, so that it takes out basically every type of food for native fish, and it can completely dominate the ecosystem. That's a bighead carp. So as you can see, and true to its name, has a massive noggin on it. And they are slimy and gross, and you can't fish them well because they eat phytoplankton and zooplankton. So these four species are awful for the economy. You can't, your recreational fishing decreases, your commercial fishing decreases, and any tourism associated with those industries will also decrease. So I've told you about how bad all of these invasive species are. So now I'm going to tell you how to manage them. So this is the invasive species management cycle. Obviously, the best way is to prevent entry. And then if you can't do that, you want to detect it as early as possible. Make sure that your responses are as soon as you find out. If you can't do that, if the invasive is already established, you need to work on controlling it. And hopefully at that point you might be able to eradicate it. And if not, you have to go into a management stage. So before I launch into that, I'm going to get you all to stop passing the balls. Hold on to your balls.
Okay. Is this mic working? Can you hear me? No. Yeah, I did. So. Can you hear me now? Okay, seems to be working. Okay, so just a little bit of a reminder of an explanation. I know that there's the yellow ball, the emoji bug ball going around, as well as the blue management balls. So you may have touched a yellow ball, then a blue ball, then a yellow ball again. Whichever one you touch last, that's the card you're going to hold up. Okay, so if you touch the yellow ball last, hold up that card. If you touch the blue ball last, hold up that card. Okay, everybody hold your cards up, and let's get another photo. Okay, well, you guys might not be able to see it, but from my perspective, that bug's really rampant. It's moved through this audience and pretty much covered almost every territory. And even though we had 2 management balls going around, it doesn't seem like it's being able to catch up to it or even keep up with it for that matter, or overtake it. So what we're going to do now is, even though we have our barrier over here and we are trying to prevent this bug from getting into the neighboring community, they've got their guys out there doing their roadside checks or whatever it is. But lo and behold, somewhere like in the middle of the night, somebody decides to drive through where there's no check and transport some firewood from our invaded area into our non-invaded area. So somebody who's invaded over here. So just to mimic the movement of firewood from our invaded area, we want you to toss the ball over into that section, whoever has it. You're up now.
You're now invaded.
Okay, so now we don't see this happening just yet because our monitoring, do we have that up on the screen yet? Our monitoring has only shown what we have going on right now, so we don't even see this happening quite yet. But because we've now noticed that it's kind of getting away from us a little bit, we're going to maybe up our management just somewhat. So we have a look around, we decide, okay, we better do a little bit more management here because we're not keeping up with this thing. So we're going to try throwing a little bit more management in over here, over there, and one over here.
So close.
Okay, so let's try and manage this a little bit more. And just check and tell you. Okay, so
Here, I'll just show you real quick what our management has been able to do.
can we move it up? Okay, so this is where it is now. See how much it's spread. It's pretty much taken over the whole middle section of the middle section. And although we've eliminated it for a pretty good part across the back there where it initially was, because it's still spreading, it's gotten away from us. It started to spread a little bit more towards the front of the room here. So although our management action is working, it's not working well enough. So let's pass those balls around again and we'll see where it ends up. Off you go. Thanks, Lauren.
So, as I mentioned, and as we saw in this lovely community over here, preventing entry of an invasive species is the top priority. And so I'm going to kind of talk about 3 main ways that we're doing prevention to hopefully not get invasive species in the first place. So this is a classic example of a physical barrier for invasive species. This is the electric barriers in the Chicago area waterway. So these are some nice large barriers across the whole river that are preventing Asian carp from getting into the Great Lakes. So it emits an electric current that deters the fish from actually swimming through it. So a physical barrier is a great way to stop an invasive from getting through the system. Obviously, it's not foolproof, and so we have to kind of build in extra fail-safes for prevention. And one of the great way to do this is actually outreach and education. So teaching people not to move firewood, not to dump bait, and this great one, the Clean Drain Dry program, to try to teach boaters how to make sure that their boats aren't spreading invasive species from one lake to the next, one river to another lake. And so, as I mentioned before, people are a great spreader of invasive species. People go on a hike in one area, walk through a patch of dog strangling vine, and don't really think about it, go to another area that didn't have dog strangling vine, but they've picked up seeds in the first area, and they've now tracked it into a new area. So outreach for these types of actions, so clean off your equipment at the end of a hike, clean off your pets. They can easily pick up invasives as well. So this is kind of the like boots on the ground, getting citizens engaged and involved and really giving them the tools they need to make sure that they're not spreading invasive species as well. And then from the top, legislation is a great preventative method for spreading invasive species. So I mentioned ballast water used to be a huge problem, but then in 2006, we created a ballast water program that really shut down that pathway. So it's obviously creating legislation isn't simple, but it's a simple way to shut down a pathway. So these are the new Canadian federal regulations for aquatic invasive species, and it lists a bunch of invasive species that cannot be moved in the country or brought in. So for example, the 4 Asian carp species can't be transported into Canada, they can't be dumped in Canada, they can't be moved in Canada unless they're dead and eviscerated. Dead and eviscerated. So all of their stuff has to be removed so they're not accidentally spreading gametes that could potentially grow into a new fish. So these are kind of compounding methods. You want to build as many methods as you can to really prevent any species from getting in to begin with, because that's going to save you the most money in the long run. Obviously, that doesn't always happen, so we want to be able to detect it as early as possible. So on our first picture, when the invasive was spreading, it was just kind of like a little area, and we saw that. We detected it, so this lovely community could put up a barrier, and they're protected from it. So detecting it as early as possible really will save you money, and this is a great example of it. So on your left, emerald ash borer, and on your right, Asian longhorn beetle. Both, similar bugs in the sense that they are wood-boring insects and they kill off trees. So emerald ash borer kills off ash trees, and Asian longhorn beetle kills off hardwood trees, namely maple trees, which is a huge problem in this area especially. They're both native to Asia, and they were both detected within the same kind of time period, one in 2002 and one in 2003. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about emerald ash borer spreading in Canada, maybe not so much Asian longhorn beetle. And here's why. So when AEB, so emerald ash borer, was first detected, they created a 10-kilometer buffer zone, and they took out 150,000 ash trees. So they wanted to try to contain this insect as much as possible. So they thought that they could create a zone where they wouldn't be able to get from one ash tree to the next by creating this 10-kilometer buffer zone. Now, with Asian longhorn beetle, they only had to take out 12,500 high-risk trees, but only 531 were likely infested with Asian longhorn beetle. So it was a much smaller scale management effort because they detected it a lot earlier in the invasion. So as you know, AEB has since spread dramatically because the management effort didn't really take into effect early enough into the invasion. It had already gotten past the barrier by the time they implemented it, but they couldn't detect it at the time. And at the time, Asian longhorn beetle was eradicated in Canada. Recently, 2013, they did find another instance of it, but they're pretty sure that this is a reintroduction. So they did eradicate it the first time, and now it's under a new eradication program, and they're hopefully going to eradicate it again. So this is kind of the idea that if you can catch an invasive species very early before it really gets a chance to establish, you can actually eradicate it and prevent it from spreading. But if you don't detect it right away and it gets the chance to really start reproducing and establishing, it's almost impossible to completely eradicate the species. Then you're going to have to go into a management and control effort. So, like I said, rapid response to an invasive is the first line of defense to a new invasive species. And one of the great examples in Canada is our Asian carp program, DFO, so the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada. In 2015, there was a grass carp sighting in the Toronto area, and the federal agencies, so Fisheries and Oceans Canada, as well as provincial with the Ontario government, the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, and municipal governments, the Toronto Regional Conservation Authority. They all came together and mounted a huge rapid response effort to this grass carp sighting. They sent out 7 boats, they had 20 staff on site a day, over 550 man hours of on-site activity, plus a whole bunch more by the federal government off-site doing research on these species, on the fish that they caught. 19 hours of electrofishing. So that's electrofishing. So they're out there shocking the water, seeing what they can find. They sent out over 10 kilometers of nets and set a bunch more other types of nets. So they mounted a huge, intensive response effort to these grass carp sightings, just to make sure that if there were any other grass carp there, that they would know about it, they would find it, and they would remove it before it could spread anymore. And luckily, they did. They got all of the grass carp that were there, didn't find any more, and it wasn't a problem. It didn't become an established species.
Okay, so we're going to do another surveillance. We're going to go out, we're going to send our people out, we're going to check the area. Our neighbors are we're going to be checking their area too to make sure that things are good. So remember, the very last color of ball that you touched is the color of card that you're going to hold up. So if you touched a blue ball last, hold up your blue card. If you touched the yellow ball last, hold up your yellow card. Okay, thank you. So while Victoria's getting that up on the screen, what we're going to describe is what we actually have going on here. So we did our surveillance, we checked it out, and from my perspective here looking, we're kind of doing not as bad of a job as we were before. We added a little bit more management in. There seems to be less invasives in this area altogether. But now we have this satellite infestation that's happened over in our neighbor community, which we of course weren't aware of. I noticed the management action was happening over there too. Probably should have told you not to do that, but that's okay, because maybe something drifted over and it's taken effect, so regardless. We still have an infestation in our neighboring community. So we go, we get them involved, we say, hey look, it's, sorry. We didn't plan on it, it got in there anyway, don't know what happened. Maybe your barrier wasn't working. But whatever it is, maybe we should work together. Maybe we should try and collaborate, figure out a better way to get rid of this thing. See, can we get rid of it? Let's see if we can. So they're gonna throw in some money, we're gonna throw in some more money and more manpower and more whatever activity that we're doing. Maybe we're going to go into research, we're going to look and see, is there anything else we can do? Is there a new type of thing that we haven't thought about yet or we haven't tried? Something that's different that we're going to maybe try and get rid of this total infestation. So we're going to add a little bit more management. We're going to do more because, okay, anybody, heads up. We're throw in a little bit more. We're going to add some into our neighboring community because that's where the satellite infestation is. Oh, it's down on the floor there.
Other side.
Under the seat. And we're going to add some, if I can throw that far. Whoa, way up there. Okay. And we're going to add some more over into this side over here, way up at the top. Whoop! It's a little sticky. Okay, that didn't happen.
That one is aggressive management.
It got there. Okay. So who is an invasive? Let me see your cards. Who's an invaded habitat? Okay. So you guys are like the new area here where you've started to establish a little bit more. So I'm going to throw one more ball in because it's still spreading. It's got more area now that it's already established in, but it's still spreading. So to mimic that, we have to add in more emoji bugs because there will be more. Even though we've gotten rid of some, they're still out there and they're still spreading. Okay. So do we have that up on the screen yet? Okay. Okay, so that's our most recent one that we just took. You can see that our management action has gotten rid of a lot of the invasives that were in the middle here, that were there the previous time. Now they've invaded back up in the top again. Maybe we weren't being as concerned because we thought we got rid of them, and maybe they came back. But we also have a few over here on our side here. That's our new satellite infestation. So obviously you can see that our previous management action wasn't really working as well as we would have liked. It's still spreading, it's still getting away, and it's still moving into new territory. So let's hope that this new management with the extra that we've decided to put in, more resources, will help. Okay, let's see what happens while Lauren takes it away.
Great. So I'm going to talk to you about control, and this is a great point for me to talk about it because, so this is what you guys were before, super invaded, and then we controlled it, and it looked like this, a lot less invaded. That's pretty awesome. Good. So obviously control is what all of the organizations that I've mentioned, from state, provincial, both federal organizations, municipal or local organizations, that's what they're putting their money into a lot of the time, is controlling these invasive species. So a great, very local example to us now, where we are, here in Peterborough, this is water soldier. And it's like an aloe type plant. The top of it looks like an aloe plant. Super serrated leaves. It floats on the top here, and it makes it impossible to use the water system. It's super spiky and dense. You can't really boat through it. You can't really swim in it. So it's a pretty bad aquatic invasive plant. So in the Trent Severn Waterway, just around this area, the population of water soldier is actually the only known wild population in all of North America. So it's being very well contained, and there's a lot of time and effort and money that goes into containing it. So these are the Great Lakes, just to get you guys situated. We're here right now, and this is where water soldier is. So this is it's kind of map from EdMaps to show the sightings of water soldier and how they're containing it into this pretty small river system. So how are they controlling this? Is it just one person? Is one guy going out like collecting plants? Obviously not, that's not going to work. It's a huge intensive undertaking from a lot of people. So when they first noticed the invasion of water soldier, they created a working group. So it's conservation authorities, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, not-for-profit organizations, federal like Parks Canada, research and academic like Trent University, and provincial here, the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, they all came together to make sure that they could keep this population of water soldier as contained as possible. So they have an intensive program where they go out, they hand harvest it, so they're controlling the actual population itself. They do eDNA testing on either side of the invasion to make sure that it's not spreading further down the river system. So as we saw in the aquatics workshop, or the invasive aquatics workshop, eDNA can test for small bits of the species. So it can really tell you whether or not it's spreading before a population can get a chance to establish. And so they also rely on the public to help with this. So they get citizen scientists engaged in going out and really monitoring and controlling this population. So they'll have like volunteer days where a bunch of people go out and remove as much of the plant as possible, and then afterwards they'll go back and they'll actually use like a spray to make sure that they're killing it as much as they can. And they've done a wonderful job. It's stayed very contained in the amount of time that they've noticed that it's in the Trent Severn waterway. And obviously there's other organizations that are funneling money into this as well to really help support the on-the-ground work that the working group is doing. And so hopefully this will be a story of eradication, because that's the name of the game. That is the best outcome. We would love to have all of the invasive species eradicated from the area so our natural native species can come back. Unfortunately, this isn't always a realistic outcome. These species are really good at establishing and continuing to survive. So we have to go into a management type action. We know that they're here. We know that we're going to have to deal with them. So we have to come up with the best management plan we can to make sure that we keep them in a contained or controllable population size. And one of my favorite success stories about that is purple loosestrife. So this was a huge problem. It was a plant that really kind of took over. It spread and outcompete native species as invasive species tend to do, and became a dominant understory species. But in the early 90s, the American government and the Canadian government decided that they really wanted to do something about this. So they released 2 species of beetle. So they decided that they were going to go with biocontrol for this because it was such a widespread problem. So they found these 2 species of leaf-eating insects that specifically feed on purple loosestrife. They did tons of research to make sure that it wouldn't impact native species and that it would only impact the purple loosestrife populations. And it worked amazingly. So where these beetles were introduced, purple loosestrife populations were reduced up to 90%, which gave native species the breathing room to actually come back and start to thrive again. So this is a great example of how you can manage an invasive species. So as I mentioned earlier, invasive species are so good at what they're doing because they don't have natural predators. They don't have anything to keep their population in check. So doing a biocontrol effort provides that natural predator to the area to keep the population in a manageable, non-invasive way. So these beetles are doing a great job. They're keeping purple loosestrife down to a manageable population level, and it's not as big of a problem as it used to be. And so that's kind of what we aim for in the management cycle. If we can't eradicate it, we want to at least get the invasive species population down to a level that our natural and native species can still provide the ecosystem services that they're there to do. So that's really all I wanted to tell you about invasive species management. And this is just kind of a great slide to show that people who work with invasive species come from as many backgrounds as you can imagine. It requires everyone coming together to work on invasive species. And this is just kind of a list of careers that people who are super interested or want to work on invasive species can get into. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. Graphic designers can do outreach and education campaigns for invasive species. Someone who has no background in science can become a citizen science volunteer just in their off time managing invasive species. So it really takes everyone coming together and the community really supporting a management plan to control invasive species. So stop moving all of your bugs and management.
Okay, so where are all the management balls right now? Can I see them? A few around. And the emoji bugs, where did they get to? There's a few around. Okay, so this is going to be our last picture, and this is going to show how well our increase in management has happened. So if the very last ball that you touched was the blue management ball, hold up your blue card. If the last ball or the ball that you touched was yellow, hold up your yellow card. Okay, just hold it nice and steady while she gets a photo. Thank you. So while Victoria's getting that up on the screen, I can tell from here there's been some changes. Some things have gotten better, some areas not so good. But let's just talk a little bit about that. So when we're doing a management action plan, we want to take a lot of things into consideration. And I guess some questions for us to consider. We're running short on time, so I'm just going to propose some questions to you to think about. And I know there's going to be a question period afterwards that maybe we can answer any questions if you have. So one question would be, if you have an invasive species, is it reasonable to expect that you can eradicate it in all cases? Possible? Not possible? Something to consider. And is it make sense financially and effort-wise to even try and do that? Like, what are the chances that you're going to be able to, and then how much resources should you put towards that? What is too much money, or what's not enough, or personnel or equipment? At what point do you say, this isn't going to work, or it's not worth the time? Do you even say that? And what do we use? What are the tools that we can use to make these determinations? What things are out there? Well, I know that we do a lot of work on risk assessments. We look at habitat, we look at climate matching, we look at the species biology itself. What is it use? What type of habitat is it attracted to? What's best for it? So if it's in an area that's very similar to the habitat it's very productive in, then you're going to make the presumption that it will be very high risk to establish there. I mean, that's one type of thing, one part of a risk assessment that you're going to look at. And then I guess consider too, when we look at the pictures of what our habitat's looking like, is that the final one there? Okay. Yeah, go ahead and put the final one up. And we're going to look at the difference between our last picture and now what happened when we added a bit more management in. So pretty good on this side of the room. You guys are pretty good. You got some good management stuff happening over there. Over there, got a little bit away from us. A little bit more invasives got into some habitat there. We maybe didn't get our management action working too well on that side. But it does go to show overall, I think we can say that we've decreased the number of invasives from early on. I mean, they were all through the center at one point, and now there isn't very many left in there. So I think we did a pretty good job of getting ahead of it. It's not eradicated, but we did get ahead of it. We put in more resources, we put in more time and effort. We got our neighboring communities to jump in with us, and I think that makes a big difference. And the only other question that I want to ask, and this isn't something that we talked about yet, but what happens if one of these emoji bugs becomes resistant to what we're doing? Say we're using a spray of some type. What happens if this particular one of those bugs has a genetic change or something happens where it's not affected by what we're doing, then what do we do? So that's another thing to consider as well. Okay, and that was all we were going to talk about with this. So now we're going to do the draw for when you guys came in and we had the exhibit and you filled out a little form to sign up to the Invasive Species Center. So whoever signed up to that, I'm going to actually ask Becky Cudmore to come up. So you get a hat, water bottle, and a little invasive species bag.
Also, if you guys want to see all the cool pictures we took, you can follow us on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook or whatever you use, and you can find yourself, show your friends how cool you are, that you're invasive or native.
Eddie Jefferson from KVFFA.
Should I put it back in the box?
Sure. There you go. Thank you. Congratulations. Okay, and one other thing, just to mention too, these cards, if you could please, when you leave the auditorium, please make sure you put them in the recycling bin on the way out so that we're not leaving litter in this room. And if any, I have a few more balls here, if anybody wants one, and you can keep the ones that are out there. I don't know. I didn't get them that far up there. Three more. You guys. That's it. All right, thank you. Thank you for being such a good participating audience.
All right. Thanks, Christine and Victoria, who is taking pictures, and Lauren from the Invasive Species Center. If you want to go on there and just retweet their things right now, please put your team number and your state or province on the tweet. All right. We'll make sure we find you. And in typical Envirothon fashion, we are taking away all your fun. The balls and the prize that Eddie got have to go to your advisors before the end of this lecture.
But you can have them back.
But you can have them back, that's right. And the green and blue pieces of paper, please do put them in the recycling. There's no green or blue, neon yellow or blue pieces of paper in your presentation packages, so if we see some in the presentation, we'll know where they come from. Sorry guys, I know I'm the worst. Before we move on to our next speaker, I just want to take 15 seconds. I want you all to stand up and get a good stretch out, okay? I'll take you to the restroom after, just come up to the top there after, once Becky gets started.
Okay, then I'll just stay here.
Okay.
I got my hat confiscated.
Are you Delaware?
Yeah.
I've got the hats out there.
Can I get them?
We'll get them, they're out on the table out there. I'll get it, you just pick it up when you're on your way out.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay. Sure. I think you just got the theater to your right. Students, please don't leave the theater. If you need a restroom break, I will find you a buddy to go with you, okay?
I think quite a few left.
Okay, I'll grab them.
I have a question. Will we be able to ask the presenters questions? Okay.
Okay, let's have a seat. All right. I should mention too that you'll get a chance to ask all of our presenters questions at the end of I'm going to go at the end. So at the end of my presentation, you'll be able to ask everybody questions. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to introduce now Becky Cudmore from Fisheries and Oceans Canada, who's going to be talking a little bit about her program. Becky.
Great. Okay. Technology. I guess I welcome everybody to Trent University. Thanks to the Envirothon organizers for inviting me. I am an invasive species biologist working for the federal government of Canada. And in fact, my interest in invasive species started actually here at Trent University. This is where I did my undergraduate. And I took an invasive ecology course in my third year and have been hooked ever since. So really appreciate Lauren going over sort of the broad umbrella talk on invasive species. You're going to hear some overlap in the concepts, but I'm going to talk very specifically about one group of species as a case study and sort of delve a little deeper into those concepts. And that group of species are Asian carps. And that's the program I manage. Lauren mentioned the $17.5 million program for the Government of Canada. And that's the program that I work on out of Burlington, Ontario, so right on the shores of Lake Ontario. Okay, sorry. Looks a little different than I'm used to, but it's working. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what are Asian carp. You got a little bit of an introduction from Lauren, but I want to talk a little bit more about their biology and what makes them so interesting and yucky all at the same time. What is the threat that they pose, specifically to the Great Lakes, and a little bit about our program and what the Government of Canada is doing about it. And I will sort of throw in a little bit about what the U.S. government's doing about it as well. So Asian carps are 4 species of fish, a group of 4. We have grass carp, big head carp, silver carp, and black carp. And each species is a little unique in terms of the part of the food web that they eat and what kind of impacts they are having on the ecosystem. So this is grass carp, and this is actually a little one. They do get to be, and I'm going to apologize for all the Americans in the audience. I'm sorry, it's the metric units here. They get to be about 30 to 50 kilograms and about 1 meter in length. They do feed primarily on the submerged and emerged aquatic plants, so they really love wetland plants. And they love them so much they can consume up to 40% of their body weight in a day. Okay, silver carp. Also a pretty large species. This is probably about an average size for a silver carp. About 40 kilograms, about 1 meter in length. And what they eat is primarily phytoplankton. So they tend to consume the algae that's floating in the water column. They're a filter feeder. They basically just suck in water and filter it out through their gills, and that's how they eat the phytoplankton. Big head carp, very similar in size. They kind of occupy the same habitat as silver carp, that kind of upper water column, not too deep. But they tend to eat the zooplankton in the water column. They are also filter feeders and feed in the same manner as the silver carp. Black carp, as Lauren introduced you to, this is the largest of the Asian carp species. Again, this is just a little guy. This actually would be pretty young. This would be about under 1 year old. They get to be about 60 kilograms and well over 1 meter in length. They look very similar to a grass carp. In fact, very difficult to tell apart until you pry open their mouths and look down into their throats. If they have teeth, we call them teeth, down in their throats that are like serrated knives, that would be a grass carp, so it shreds the plants. If it's got molars that look, is kind of freaky, but it looks identical to our molars down here, it's a black carp, so it crushes mollusks. And where did they come from? Well, I think it's kind of obvious the name. They are from Asia and southern Russia, and all 4 species have pretty overlapping native ranges. I'm going to talk a little bit about their spawning biology from what that we know about them from where they're from. Well, they're highly reproductive. The number of eggs per female averages in the hundreds of thousands per female. They tend to mature around age 3 or 4, and they're summer spawners. And I'm putting what is the mid-North American time, just because of the just to understand about the spawning times that they are here in North America. But they it tends to be about the July. Would be about July here, compared to their native range. They're considered large river spawners. I don't know if you guys are familiar enough about the spawning habitats or spawning habits of salmon, but they work in the same kind of way. They tend to live in the lake, and then when it's spawning time, they run up a river, they drop their eggs, and then it floats down and hatches out at the bottom of the river. And that's a really simplistic way to describe their spawning biology. They do need these large rivers. In their native range, they need this spike in the flow or the temperature to signal for them, it's time, move up the river. They're looking for areas where there's a lot of turbulence to drop their eggs so that the eggs are nicely aerated. They need to go up so far in the river so that the eggs have a lot of time to float down the river, and all while it's floating, it's hatching. It can't drop out. If it drops out, the egg won't mature and develop. And it needs to be at a certain flow. If it's too fast, they get flushed right out of the system. If it's too slow, they will drop. And it has to be perfect, so that by the time the egg and the hatched larvae reach the bottom of the river, it needs a nice wetland to settle out in, and then the young live in that wetland area, so it's like a nursery for them. They're well protected because they're just little at that point, and they're well protected and they can hide in the plants. And also wetlands are so highly productive, there's a lot of food for these fish. So that's how things work in their native range. So we learned a lot about them when talking to our colleagues that deal with these fish on an everyday basis. And we can make some predictions of their risk and what impacts they may have and other things like that. But like some invasive species tend to do, they can surprise us. So while this was the list of things required for spawning for Asian carp, they tend to do things a little differently once they got here to North America, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how they got here. They still seem to need some sort of trigger to have them move up a river, but they don't seem to need that turbulence. There's been cases of a colleague of mine from Missouri had Asian carp eggs in a bag with some sediment on the bottom, and he just had it on his desk, and he was going to do some sort of genetic testing on the eggs, but he didn't really need them live, so he just had them on his desk. Well, a few days later, he just noticed some movement out of the corner of his eye, and he looked, and the eggs had hatched. Obviously, there was no turbulence, there was no long drifting down a river. They hatched. We are also seeing some evidence of spawning in areas we never would have predicted they could spawn in. The rivers are much narrower than we thought, and this would be in the Wabash River. Much more narrow than we thought, and a lot shorter distance. Maybe 30 kilometers now we're thinking, rather than the hundreds of kilometers we thought they used to need. The nursery habitat, anyone here from Missouri? So in Missouri, you guys have awesome rivers there, but you wouldn't say that they were particularly vegetated, I would think. They're pretty cleared out from vegetation, and they look like chocolate milk, so there's not a lot of light penetrating in. But there's a lot of Asian carp there, so they seem to be doing just fine without a lot of that vegetation for food and cover. And the other interesting thing we're finding of Asian carp populations in the United States where they're established is instead of that 2 to 3 years for maturing, they're maturing a lot earlier, as early as 1 year old, they're maturing. And while we would have predicted based on the timing, the temperature, the latitude, all that sort of stuff from their native range, we would have predicted they would just spawn in July in the mid-North American latitude. We've seen eggs in September. So not only can they spawn at later times of the year, and therefore colder times of the year, we're finding instead of once a year spawning, they're spawning 2-3 times a year. And so when you have a female with hundreds of thousands of eggs and the ability to spawn a couple of times a year, you can see how much that would increase in the population. And these fish grow. So I pointed out that one that was probably less than a year old, and they can grow up to be a meter. They reach that very quickly. So this is a growth chart for grass carp, and you can see such significant growth in that first year. And then followed by continuous high growth for the next subsequent years. What does this mean? Well, this means they quickly outgrow predators. So you may think, well, a muskie will take care of it, or a snakehead if we had them. They actually can't. So they are hidden in that nursery habitat, and they can use the plants to hide from predators. And by the time they reach to move out of the nursery habitat, they've reached a size that they've outgrown most fish and bird predators. And the interesting thing about this fish as well, they will stop their growth, and most species do. They will stop their growth when there's no food available. Well, most species tend to slow their growth, but these fish actually will stop their growth. And in times where there's absolutely no food available, these fish will survive for a year or longer. What they end up happening is they have these monster heads and very thin bodies, but they're still living. So really interesting. So what does that mean? Overall, Asian carp are good invaders. So Lauren talked about what makes a good invader. Well, we can check off the list here for Asian carp. We know they produce a lot of offspring. They grow really quickly, therefore they outgrow any potential predators. We know that they're very adaptable. We're seeing them adapting to a North American environment. And they are survivors. They will make sure that they survive. So they get a gold star. So, how did they get here, Asian carp? Well, they were brought here on purpose. Well-intentioned use in aquaculture facilities for most of these species. So these were down in the southern U.S., and they were brought in by the U.S. federal government, not ever intending for them to get in the natural environment. They were to stay in these catfish farm ponds, and that's where they were supposed to stay. However, there were some major flooding events that occurred, and it allowed these fish to escape and into the natural environment. And in some cases, it was thought that, there's a lot of aquaculture farms, drainage ditches that get clogged with plants and can be really problematic. And there would be a lot of people that don't want to use a lot of chemicals in the aquatic environment, especially if you're talking stocked ponds that you may want to actually fish out of. So why not add a fish that can eat a lot of plants? And we don't really have a lot of plant-eating fish in North America. So grass carp specifically was purposely stocked into places in the natural environment for the purpose of decreasing some plant problems, aquatic plant problems. And two species of Asian carp, namely the big head carp and the grass carp, are apparently really good eating. Now, I haven't eaten them. I'm actually allergic to fish. I know, odd job choice. But people love them. And so they are moved around in North America from aquaculture facilities for the purposes of food. Again, not supposed to be put into the natural environment, but for a variety of reasons, these fish are now available in a trade for purchase. And what somebody does, even though it's supposed to be on their dinner plate, they may, for a variety of reasons, whether it's animal rights reasons, just because, sometimes there's a cultural reason. If you release a fish that, you get points for your afterlife. There's a variety of reasons that people release wild animals. And so while the live food trade is not meant for these fish to end up in the natural environment, they have been found in the natural environment. There's also been an incident, and it's really hard to locate picture. I really tried to look for it, where there was a truck full of tilapia, so not Asian carp, but tilapia, crashed on one of the major highways here in Ontario, and the highway was just full of flopping fish. So these transport trucks hold thousands of individuals, and if those were to occur, an accident was to occur, you could kind of imagine that the likelihood of those fish making it into a natural water body is not outside the realm of possibility. So anyway, live trig. So this is an example, or this is an animated map just showing the spread of these species basically in a few decades. So they're pretty much marching up the Mississippi River Basin and heading towards the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes is co-managed and shared. It's an international body of water by both the US and Canadian governments. So the focus is to protect the very expensive resources of the Great Lakes Basin by focusing on not allowing these fish to reach the Great Lakes. So where are they very specifically right now? So Laura mentioned there's an electrical barrier in the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. So that's that star up there. And where we know bighead and silver carp specifically, when we talk about Asian carp, for the most part we talk about it as a group, but sometimes you've got to break it out. You can see that we've got verified spawning up fairly high into the Mississippi River Basin. So that's specifically the Illinois River. Actually, who's from Illinois? Yeah. So your state of guys are doing an amazing job here. They're basically our gatekeepers to the Great Lakes. Ton of work being done in Illinois. And while we see presence and maybe some attempts at spawning, we're still a little good distance yet from the electrical barrier, but getting a little too close for comfort, absolutely. So with bighead and silver carp. Black carp, you know, until about 2 years ago, there had been something like 43 black carp ever caught in North America, so it was kind of, you know, on the scale of Asian carp to be concerned about, it really was kind of like low on everybody's radar. But in the last 2 to 3 years, they keep popping up more and more and more. And even 3 years ago, we would have said, oh, they're not established. We don't have any. Well, now we're seeing little black carp. And nobody uses little black carp anymore, so where else could they come from but from a spawning population somewhere out there? So while we thought we were pretty good, they were way down south. Now we're seeing them moving up even further into the Illinois River and getting a little close to the Great Lakes. Grass carp. Now grass carp is a little bit more out there because it had about a 20-year head start on being put into the natural environment by well-meaning people trying to control aquatic plants in their farm ponds and their aquaculture ditches, urban ponds, things like that. So quite a bit more instances of Asian grass carp close around the Great Lakes. And in fact, I apologize to you guys, but down here, there is evidence of reproduction occurring in the southern Lake Erie Basin right now. So definitely cause for concern. So what impacts have we seen by these species? Loss of diversity in some areas where these species have invaded. For every 10 fish pulled out of the river, 9 are now Asian carp. So if you were a commercial fisherman and you need a nice variety of species for your sales, now you're dealing with these kind of crappy fish that, yes, some people like them, but not enough of a market to do well. It's a pretty low dollar value fish. We're seeing loss of habitat with grass carp. They can decimate on a wetland area. One grass carp can totally destroy 1 hectare, 1 hectare of wetland in just a few months. We see damage to nets. These fish are pretty heavy. There's a lot of them, and they're wrecking commercial fishermen nets. I mentioned the decline in the fishery value. And then for silver carp, very specifically, this behavior. And Lauren said it's kind of funny but actually I've been on that boat and I've been hit by one of these, and it's actually quite unpleasant. You're on a moving boat, you've got say a 12 to 14 pound fish jumping up and smacking you. So there has been a lot of injury and damage to equipment. And then interestingly enough, in that kind of odd adaptive way, they don't do this in their native range. They don't jump. And in fact, I was out, I think on this river with biologists and scientists from China who had come over to help us better understand these Asian carp. And this was now, oh my gosh, about 8 years ago. And the one scientist was he was kind of freaking out. Didn't speak a word of English, but you could tell he was really uncomfortable. And it's because this species that he knows so well, that he studies all the time back home, don't do that. And it kind of freaked him out. And he actually asked to get off the boat because it bothered him so much. We still don't really know why they do it. It's probably just an alarm cue response. An invasive population can grow to such a cluster that I think it's just setting them off, where in their native range they tend to spread out a little bit more. So this is what we think is happening. People say it's just because of the motorboats, but they have boats in their native range too. So we think it's more of an alarm cue response to being overcrowded. So what do we do when we're looking at being concerned about an invasive species that may be coming to our area or just showed up, and we want to know how big of a deal is it? We do risk assessment. And basically the idea for risk assessment is to look at the probability of introduction. So what's the likelihood the species could arrive, survive, establish, and spread? And if it did that, what would the magnitude of the consequences be? I have down here ecological consequences, which is where the Canadian government's a little unique in that it's not that we don't care what the cost is to us as a society or what the price tag is, but we actually care a lot about those ecological consequences. So we focus on that first. That's the first step. We will do the social economic consequences as a secondary step, but we keep them very separate. I know other countries, US is included, they just do consequences. But basically you want to know, if they were to arrive, survive, establish, and spread, what would the impacts be? And that you would use to determine your overall risk. And you do this in a pretty rigorous fashion, peer review, because you want it to be scientifically defensible advice for governments. So you want to be able to give them this information so that they can determine what kind of activities do they need to do with respect to prevention, monitoring, early detection, outreach, research, and control or management. So this is kind of the underpinning for a lot of our invasive species management actions. And because of the concern of those fish sort of marching up the Mississippi River Basin, Canada and the US got together and said, well, there might have been a swear word or two, but oh my God, we've got to protect the Great Lakes. It's a $7 billion fishery, and that fishery alone, but there's cottaging. We have a lot of species at risk. We have special ecosystems that we want to protect. So we need to get together and try to decide, how big of a deal is this? Because there was a lot of, so this was back in about 2010, and there was a lot of people yapping about it in the media saying, yeah, but like Canada, God, that's so cold. So I guess you guys can go back and say about how cold it is here after this week. There's too cold for Asian carp. They won't survive, they won't live, they won't be able to reproduce. And yeah, they're a problem in the Mississippi River Basin, but we're talking about a big lake ecosystem, so they're not going to find habitat there, so it's no big deal. Where other people are like, I don't know, kind of a problem. I've been to Canada, it's not that cold. So in order for the governments, basically at that point, both governments are kind of, they had their hands tied behind their backs. They were kind of stalled. They didn't know what to do, because some people are saying, don't waste the money, and some people are saying, oh my God, spend the money, get moving. So we did a risk assessment together. And what were some of the key results? So you remember, we want to look at what are the likelihood the species would arrive as the first step. So the first thing we think about is, how could they arrive? And so we looked at all the possible ways, the routes of entry for very specifically bighead and silver carp. How could they arrive in the Great Lakes? Well, we determined that the most likely entry point was that Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. The Mississippi River Basin and the Great Lakes Basin are naturally divided for the most part. But for a variety of reasons, we built a canal to connect the two. And so that was the route. Despite the fact there was an electrical barrier in place, it was still the most likely entry point to the Great Lakes by these fish. There are other physical connections. Most of them would be like, oh, if it was a 100-year flood, it could flood out, but we still have to identify those and put a level of risk and probability on that. We did note that trade is an issue. We did, up until 2015, allow Asian carp live into Canada. Not in Ontario. There was provincial laws that you couldn't hold them here, but importing them is a federal responsibility, and you could technically import them in. But we really had a difficulty assigning some probabilities to that, so what we had to note was that more research was needed to assess that pathway. Is it too cold? Well, wherever is red is an overlapping of 9 environmental characteristics compared to where these fish are found in their native range. So we took 9 characteristics, ecological and environmental characteristics in their native range, and we mapped them out to where do they exist in Canada. Everywhere is red is a 90 to 100% match, meaning that they could, in theory, survive. So you can kind of see Canada's not that cold, and they would do fine here. They would also allow them not only just to survive, but they could actually overwinter as well. Also, in terms of survival, we have to look at whether or not there's food available for them. And some people said, well, because they're filter feeders, zebra mussels are already here, and they're a filter feeder, so there won't be any food left for them. So we found that they actually won't compete with zebra mussels. There's a lot out there. Certainly enough food available for everybody. And not only that, but the pseudofeces from the zebra mussels provides an additional food source for the Asian carp. So that's great. So we think they could get here, we think they'd survive, but the real key is would they establish? So would they be able to reproduce that next generation? So we looked at what all the spawning characteristics as best as we knew it at the time from both their native range, but we also had to include, which was unique, the new things we were seeing from them in their introduced range, and tried to map it out for both Canada and the US, where there would be suitable spawning tributaries. In Canada alone, there was 57 of them, so plenty of spawning habitats. The Great Lakes are rife with a lot of wetland areas, despite the fact of another invasive common carp coming in and destroying probably what was amazing conditions 200 years ago. And we found, we did some population modeling and found that it would only take about 10 males and 10 females to establish, if they were in the same area, to establish a reproducing population that would lead to next generations. So if they were able to establish, how far would they go and how quickly? So you can imagine that's pretty important information as an invasive species manager you'd need to know. We saw how quickly things moved with the emoji ball. But depending on the species, it can move faster or slower. So we did, again, some more population modeling on natural dispersal once the species were to enter the Great Lakes, and found that they would, if they were to be introduced into Lake Michigan, how long would it take to spread to the other lakes? And we modeled that it would take about 20 years, which seems like a long time, but when you're dealing with an ecosystem, that's actually pretty rapid. Obviously, the center lakes, Michigan, Huron, and Erie would be the first impacted, and then it would take a little longer to get into the Lake Superior and Lake Ontario. And what kind of potential ecological impacts could we see? Well, Lauren talked about how invasive species compete for resources. You got fish that can eat up to 40% of their body weight a day. They're large bodied, they can outcompete our native species, not only for the space but also for the food. So we would see impacts to the planktivores, so the plankton-eating fish, very quickly. And that would reduce the overall biodiversity of the fish population of the Great Lakes. And then, of course, there would be the cascading effects from that. So not only with the loss of wetland areas, if there was grass carp there, but also out competing for